Hi everyone. So before I get into the main video, just a word for WWE fans out there. I've been getting back into that recently, and I was watching the 2021 Royal Rumble, and it's great to see Edge and Christian reunited. Anyone who grew up with the Attitude Era, as I did, will remember they were one of the best tag teams around. So yeah, great to see that. Okay, now on to important matters. um, this is something I've touched on before, but I want to be quite specific because I was just looking over some old videos I made last night, and I thought that some of the issues are still very, very relevant, unfortunately, and they deserve a bit of scrutiny. Um, so the title I've given this video is the naked bigotry of the woke left. Now you might wonder why am I saying naked bigotry? Well, in this sense, I'm looking at it as bigotry that isn't embarrassed about itself, that isn't ashamed of itself, that doesn't have any sense of introspection whatsoever. Hence, it's naked, it's open to see. And I really do believe that's the case. And I think this is the case because the sort of mindset and school of thought that I'm talking about is so confident in its own way of thinking that it doesn't see the bigotry at all. Now, I suppose you could make the argument that all bigots have that mentality until they maybe get to a point where they realize that they're wrong and they try to make amends or they try to, reevaluate their way of looking at the world. But it's something I've noticed with the woke left. There is this dogmatic, intense sense of righteousness. And I'm sure there's right wing equivalents. I mean, and I'll just reference this briefly because it's been talked about a lot, but those people who stormed the US Capitol on the 6th of January, they're dogmatic. They believe they're absolutely right. They believe there's a massive conspiracy to steal the election, and they were vindicated. So that's dogma as well. And there's two things I want to be clear about in this video. Firstly, when I'm talking about the woke left, I am not talking about the left in general. It's very important. This is not a sweeping attack on all left leaning people. And the second point is, nor is it an attempt to downplay the bigotry of the right, of which there are plenty of examples. It's neither of those things. On the first point about not being a sweeping attack on the left, this is something that I've noticed um, recently when some people have defended wokeism. I think they've misunderstood that the critique of wokeism isn't a critique of progressive politics. Not at all. And in this video, I'm going to lay out some of the reasons why that isn't the case. I think it's very misguided to defend wokeism on the grounds that, oh, but they're just speaking against racism. They're just speaking against sexism. You know, their heart's in the right place. I think that totally misses the point. Because I think actually that contemporary wokeism, as opposed perhaps to what it was originally about, um, the term itself actually originates from the 1970s, with the sort of Black Power movement of the time. Unless I'm mistaken, someone perhaps can correct me on this, but unless I'm mistaken, that's where it originates from. The idea of being awoken to injustice. And it kind of got revived about roughly 5 years ago. I'm speaking very rough terms here. Um, but the interesting thing is that whilst people may see it as a pejorative, it's its advocates who were originally reviving it, and they were talking about the need to be woken, the need to be awoken. Um, Now, when they're facing criticism, they're saying it's a pejorative, it's a slur, it's an attack. But the term itself is not actually that derogatory. It just means being awoken. So attacking wokeism is just calling out some of the BS that goes on within it. it's not necessarily a slur in of itself, although personally I wouldn't like to be seen as woke, given its connotations nowadays. Um, but I want to discuss what I see really as something that is very toxic from that way of thinking. Um, One example of a prominent person involved in this, so she's relatively prominent. I don't want to give her too much credit. She's not a celebrity. She's not, perhaps not a public figure so much, but she, was in the news a few years ago. And this is a young woman by the name of Clara Genova, who's a Harvard graduate. She's an Asian American, and basically she got notoriety for a while because she was threatening to stab people who said all lives matter. I made a video concerning her at the time. I also made a video, and I actually encompass it in the same video about Terry Crews, the actor who got heat because he said he wouldn't support Black Lives Matter. He's a black actor, and he said he wouldn't support them. Now, I thought, well, I made that video that time. Let's give her the benefit of the doubt. So I went to her Facebook page to see if she changed her tune, if she'd shown any remorse, because I'm interested, can people change? And one of her latest posts was an attack on mixed race couples, specifically on white guys who date Asian women. I've been vocal about this issue before. I think there's an enormous amount of prejudice leveled against that particular couple. And without going into too many details here, because it's maybe for another video, but the prejudice tends to be that the white guys, and I hate this concept, but the white guys have an Asian fetish, and they only look for Asian girlfriends, and therefore they're inherently racist because they're excluding other races. And the prejudice against Asian women is that they're betraying their own people. This is a very toxic and ugly way of looking at couples. Even if that is true for some people in that situation, the fact that people think that they could show such open hostility is disgusting, in my opinion. I've dated Asian women, but I have never taken the approach that I will only date Asian women. But by the same token, I don't need to explain or justify myself to anyone. Um, I mean, I'm not attracted to all Asian women. Um, there's some Asian women I find very off-putting. She would be one example. Um, but that was one of her latest posts. She's just stirring up hatred. She's just stirring up animosity. Bear in mind, right up until the 1960s in the United States, mixed race couples, well, in some states it was downright illegal. Um, anyway, that subject is probably for another video. I could a lot more to say about that, but for now, yeah, origin over. Basically that rant about threatening to stab people who said all lives matter. It cost her a job at the services company Deloitte. Now, bear in mind, she's a Harvard graduate. She could have easily got that job. Um, to be fair to Deloitte, it's a rare example of a company actually being consistent and taking a stand against a minority racist. What she said was inflammatory, disgusting, and instead of showing some introspection and some remorse and saying, I shouldn't have said that, it was a heat of the moment thing, I was angry, something like that, she doubled down, she felt sorry for herself, and she got into a tearful video where she was blubbering away and feeling sorry for herself. So I think Clara Genova, and she's far from the only example, is an example of a woke leftist who's absolutely incapable of introspection. Incapable. Because their whole worldview is structured around this idea, particularly if they're a minority person. There's a whole other way of thinking with white woke leftists. And it might sound crude breaking it up that way, but I would put it this way. What I've seen of minority people who are of this school of thought is they feel vindicated because they're a minority. They feel, well, I can't be bigoted because I'm a minority. That's basically the way of thinking. And what I find concerning is These people are often educated. They're often should be intelligent. They go to world-renowned institutions like Harvard, like Oxford, Cambridge, but they come out with this absolute manure, which amounts to a very narrow worldview. Um, I mean, I can cite many examples. Dr. Priyamvada Gopal is another example. She's constantly coming out about white privilege and white systemic racism. And, um, if you're not familiar, she was a professor. She is a professor at Cambridge University. And around the same time that Professor David Starkey got fired for his comments about black people, which were crude and, they were beneath him. He shouldn't have said them. He got fired. He did express remorse for that, but he got fired. She made equally derogatory comments about white people. She kept her job. Not only did she keep her job, but many of her left wing students rallied to defend her. Um, Not surprisingly, she's very much about the dismantling colonialism. Um, my issue is not so much about the opinions that these people have, as much as I think many of those opinions are toxic. It's about the double standards. Now, Deloitte's not employing Clara Genova is a rare example of a company actually taking a stand against a minority racist, but more often than not, they get a free pass. An example of this is Sarah Jong. She's a Korean American who made some very racist comments about white people. She claimed that she was only retorting against right wing trolls. I never believed that excuse because if that was the case, she would have specifically said that. She would have said, I'm not talking about all white people, I'm talking about, these right wing trolls that I've been putting up with. No, her thing was against all white people. So for her to not take ownership of that, to not admit that was pathetic. But she got a job at the New York Times. This is a world-renowned publication. She gets a job there. Now, had a white journalist, like myself, for example, I want to get into that world. I'm starting off, but if I'd said something like that, I could kiss any job goodbye. Um, Never mind a famous publication like the New York Times. I wouldn't get, a job in a local publication. So it's not so much the opinions I find galling; it's the double standards and this idea that minority racists have that they have a green light to have those opinions. And I do say racist. I'm not someone who throws words around, and I've accused the woke left of weaponizing the term racism. When I say racism, I make damn sure that there's a basis for it. What's the basis? The basis is making a crude, vilifying generalization of a whole race. I've said that the term white privilege is a racist concept, and I stand by that. I believe it is. I believe that saying all white people are the same is a fundamentally racist position to take. And woke activists double down and say, oh, but they're not saying all white people are wealthy. And then they get into this whole thing about systemic racism. But if you're judging an entire group as one, then whatever way you gloss it over, that is a racist position to hold. You might find particular issues within a race, a particular problem within a demographic, and that's taboo even. But what you can never do is say all people are the same. Um, so I'm sick and tired of minority racists getting a free pass and getting a green light for the bigotry. They're so often they're so arrogant and so egotistical that they believe. I think it's a combination of things. I think it is arrogance, but I also think it is the fact that they have convinced themselves that they're a victim. So, anyone who attacks them, I mean, a classic line will be, "Oh, this white man is attacking me. He cannot stand an independent Asian woman speaking for herself." No, maybe he just doesn't like hearing a bigot coming out with generalizing nonsense. Maybe he doesn't like the fact that he has an Asian wife or Asian girlfriend and he doesn't like your crude categorization of that relationship, etc. Um, but I mentioned white allies or white people who endorse this mindset. They're some of the worst bigots around. I mean, for them, their green light is the fact that they're allies. So what they do is they turn a blind eye to it, and sometimes they're outright self-hating. And it's kind of an extreme form of virtue signaling. Now, I've never used the term do-gooder because I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with someone seeing problems in society and trying to make it better, whether that be finding a way to help the homeless, whether it be empowering women, whether it be you name it. There's nothing at all wrong with those sort of things. I've never been against that sort of progressive, genuinely progressive politics. But what I take issue with is the falseness of saying that you're progressive, whilst you're really going out of your way to be divisive. I was going to say secretly. Well, it's not so secret. Um, I mean, I remember when that book came out, Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race, and people can say, well, the content wasn't that inflammatory, but to me, if you are deliberately choosing a title like that, and I know there's the expression don't judge a book by its cover, but there's also marketing. And if you're naming a book, Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race, automatically you're repelling white people. You're saying that you don't value the opinion of white people because they're all racist. Therefore, don't read my book. Therefore, I can't say anything to you. Um, the author was Rennie Edo Lodge. Now, immediately you had people like Emma Watson and others, white woke activists, jumping over themselves to endorse her and talk about what a brave woman she was and how enlightened. I'm thinking, what has she done that's so enlightened? All she has done is further division. All she has done is present white people as the enemy. And it's just even if the book itself was more moderate and a bit more balanced and just talking about her personal experience as a young black woman, the fact of the matter is it was pitched to be divisive. That's the bottom line. It was pitched to be divisive. And I think there is something very, very manipulative about the woke left. Because they claim this mantle of being all about tackling racism and sexism, it's actually very manipulative because if you criticize them, it's very easy for them to frame it as, well, you must have a vested interest in speaking out against me. I'm against racism, right? So it's very easy for them to frame their critics as therefore being against progress, somehow being for racism. Well, personally, I'm consistent and I know what my record is. I've always spoken out against white racists, and I always will. I've always abhorred white supremacy, white nationalism, that sort of thing. I always have. And unlike some on the right, I do recognise there's a problem with that. But I also think that you don't tackle that problem by, endorsing other forms of racism. There has to be consistency. Now, I'm at 18 minutes. I'm going to wrap this up quite soon. But, you cannot say that you're progressive if you're pushing divisive viewpoints. And the most manipulative thing about this is that when they're challenged, they'll say, oh, it's not about generalizing all white people. It's not about vilifying them. Um, because, there is nothing that a woke activist hates more than someone who looks like me, a white bloke, who challenges them. They will immediately see me as the enemy. Now, I'm well aware that there are white guys who endorse this movement. It might be their sincere viewpoint, but a cynical side of me suspects that they're trying to garner points. Because actually, when it comes to tertiary education, and when it comes to companies that have an obsession about diversity over meritocracy, then being woke is actually quite beneficial because The more enlightened you come across, even though it's, like I say, a false facade, I don't believe it is enlightened, um, the easier it makes life. Someone who speaks out against that will find themselves denounced, possibly losing their job, possibly cancelled. And I'm not just talking about white people. Others who challenge this idea will find themselves seen as traitors to the cause. Um, my friend, I can't say she's a close friend, but I'm connected with her, Melissa Chen, Singaporean American journalist. Um, she to me is a very reasonable centrist person, but because she's challenged the woke left, she's been denounced as fascist. I mean, this is an upside down situation that we're in. Actually, I'll close with this point. I recently saw a little meme showing a centrist person, and they were on this little line, and there was a left wing person and right wing person, and the left wing person pushes them to the right physically, and then says, "Why are you joining the fascists?" The point being that centrists have been pushed to the right. What I would say about that is it's true to some extent. To some extent, I only say to some extent because it's too simplistic to say that centrist people have become right wingers. Speaking for myself, there's still a lot about the right I dislike. I do think there is a little bit of a survival of the fittest mentality going on there. Um, I do think that there's far too many right wingers willing to defend Trump and Trumpism and its contempt for democracy. So, it's too simplistic to say, and if I was an American, my views on guns would definitely be seen as a left wing position. But I think that it is true that reasonable people, whether they be centrist or centre left, have been pushed more to the right or more to the centre because of the blind intolerance and the toxic way of thinking of the woke left. But it's not just about opinions. They are not above bullying, harassing people. And when you really strip it back, it's ugly. It's ugly. It's unpleasant. It's a very, very narrow worldview. It's the opposite of Martin Luther King's vision. And I think it's just very, very sad that there are people out there who have that mentality in the year 2022. But they're enabled because of this false premise that they are progressive. They're not progressive. I think we need to stop talking about progressive politics in the same vein as wokeism, because there's nothing progressive about it. Taken as a pure adjective, progressive. There's nothing progressive about the way they think. There's nothing progressive about deliberately seeking to divide society. There's nothing progressive about critical race theory that tells white children that they are the enemy. There was a school in Brighton that recently, surprise, surprise, Brighton Council's the Green Party. Well, that says it all, really. Well, they tried to tell children as young as 5 that they should be aware of their systemic white privilege and, the fact that they are historic oppressors. The position I take with that is there's nothing wrong with teaching about historic racism. There's nothing wrong about teaching about Jim Crow and segregation and all of that. But do it in a responsible way. Do not tell white children that they're fundamentally racist, and do not tell minority children that they're perpetual victims. Because all that is doing is sowing hatred in the minds of children. That's evil. I'd go so far as to say it's evil. And it's one reason I despise the way that the left, the woke left, think about things. I call them reasonable left people. People who perhaps have some socialist principles or liberal principles. They believe in employee rights. They believe in traditionally opposing racism and sexism. They're middle ground feminists. I'm talking about those sort of people. I call on them, please do the right thing. Call out the extremes in your midst. Call out the extremes in your midst. I've called for conservatives to call out Trumpism and, reasonable right leaning people to recognize the extremes there. And, Trumpism is just one example. But as a general approach, I think centrists everywhere need to call out the extremes. But I've heard this absurd idea coming from some woke editorials that centrists are really just right wingers. Well, The truth is, centrists are sick and tired of your BS. They're sick and tired of seeing the hypocrisy, the divisiveness, and bigotry masquerading as progress. Just because you're a minority person doesn't mean that you have a green light to sow your bigotry. And as far as I'm concerned, you need to be called out. And if you're white and you're endorsing it, you're part of the problem. For me, I'm consistent, and I know what my record is, so that's all there is to it. But I loathe the hypocrisy of woke thinking. I loathe the dishonesty of woke thinking. There may be some people who see themselves as woke and their heart's in the right place, but as a movement, as an ideology, I would say strip it back. It is incredibly bigoted. It's incredibly narrow. Um, and it's either, you agree with them or else. It's the Western contemporary equivalent of the Red Guards in the 60s. Not as bad because people aren't being murdered on the streets to the same extent. 30 people died in the urban uh, violence of 2020, but we're not seeing thousands killed as was the case in China's Cultural Revolution, so it's not that bad. But it's the equivalent insofar as the extreme intolerance and the groupthink and the mob-like mentality that goes on. And it's toxic. And to see professors, baby boomer generation academics who are poisoning the minds of young people, this is often leveled at millennials, but there are baby boomer wokes as well who are poisoning the minds of young people. And it's very, very sad to see. Thanks for watching.